Hey there, welcome to the Gathering KC. My name is Ryan, and I'm honored that you chose to be here with us tonight. There's probably a lot of other places that we could be. There's a lot of red going on this weekend for some reason. Something about sports ball, I don't know. But I'm honored that you're here tonight, and it's my privilege to talk and to share with you as we start this week 4 in a series titled Family. And I hope that you've been challenged and motivated and are learning how to work on relationships in your family. I've been told since last week that it brought up some conviction for one person who said, "Hey, thanks so much for reminding me to reach out to my father because he's such an extremely hard person to deal with." And we started out in the first week, talking about the ideal versus the real. We all live in a reality, but we have this ideal of what our family should look like, what our relationships could look like. And we never want to give up on that because as we continue to grow from the reality of where we are to where we want to be. And then we discussed the following week the power of mutual submission, the fact that when we submit one to another, that it really changes the dynamic of our relationships. Last week we talked about that big word, reconciliation. That thing when you and I are willing to step into reconciliation, that it can bring dead relationships back to life. So today we're going to talk about family conflict, and I'm sure that no one present ever has dealt with family conflict. Now, granted, we all come from families that are different one from another. I'm sure we all have different family origin stories, of our beginnings. But there's one thing we all have in common in families, and that's that we all have conflict. And one thing that time has taught me is that when I win an argument in a family, I don't really win. You know what I mean? Nobody really wins. Take work, for instance, though. You win an argument, and so, somebody gives you the high five because you won, or we win an argument at the boardroom or in the courtroom, or and whenever that happens, you always get like an accolade for somebody, yeah, you did a good job. But when we win an argument in our living room or in our bedroom, really there's no win there. For a moment, you might relish in the fact that, you out-argued the other person in the family, but there really is no win. And the conflict never really gets resolved. So when it comes to family conflict in the family, it's like no other conflict that we deal with. And part of that is because it's just so complicated. Our emotions are tied into these conflicts more than any other kind of conflict we deal with. And it's something that just keeps going on and on. And what seems to make conflict in the family so much more complicated is that we don't approach it all the same depending on who we are as individuals. When it comes to family conflict, some of us are peacekeepers. We're that person that just wants to keep the peace. We won't argue for anything. We'll do whatever to remove the conflict, as soon as we can, as fast as we can. It's that person that goes, "It's okay. We're all okay. It's going to be fine. Let's just move on rather than try to resolve it." And it's hard to get pushback from that person, no matter what. And then we have the sulker, you're just down. And even after the conflict gets somewhat resolved, someone will say, "Hey, how are you doing?" You go, kind of like Eeyore, "I'm fine." But you don't seem fine. And then there's that stuffer, which maybe a lot of us men probably fall into this one. "Hey, is everything okay?" "Yeah, it's fine. It's just fine. I'm fine, okay? Don't ask me anymore." And the stuffer, this person never really addresses the issue. They just keep pushing down the conflict and their feeling and whatever's going on. And then there's the litigator. And this is probably the best arguer of all the family arguers. And if this is you, you always win. You're never going to be wrong, at least in your own mind. And since you're so good at arguing, no one else in the family really wants to argue with you. They already know no matter what, you're going to win the argument. But at the end, you realize you've not really won anything. And then there's the screamer. This has become kind of popular in culture, I think, maybe in the last few years. It was something new to me when my wife and I became married, and some of her family members I got to interact with. But the screamer is that person who just has to yell. And now if you're raised in a family where everyone had to scream and yell to feel like their voice was going to be heard, it's quite possible you're not married to someone who is a screamer. And you likely didn't marry a litigator because they can raise their voice at times. And you likely married somebody who's a sulker or a stuffer, possibly one of the peacekeepers. Probably the first argument you ever had, you just went to the top and started yelling, and your spouse probably looked at you like you were from outer space or something, because it startled them, and they didn't come from a family that yelled or raised their voices, and it was strange, it was foreign to them. And then as that type of person, you realize that your words and your volume weigh like 1,000 pounds, and that you can crush people with that kind of weight. And then they just won't argue back. They won't yell back. And they'll just decide something's wrong with you. And then they start coming at you and they say, hey man, you don't have to yell. And so you give that typical exclamation, sometimes you just got to air things out. And really no one wins. So it's just complicated. Families are complicated. And there's going to be conflict as long as our families exist. Despite the fact that there's so many different types of people and different approaches to conflict, there's only one source of conflict really in our families. And it's kind of personal, and it can tend to be kind of ugly. And if we could take the time to wrap our brains and our hearts around this idea and grasp onto it, it'll lower the tension and the conflict level. And the tone, it will all decrease instantly inside your relationships and family. And that's how powerful this principle is. So James, if you're familiar with who he is, he was the half-brother of Jesus. And he writes a letter to the Christians of the church in the first century. And this letter is part of our Bible in the New Testament, and all of our really great ways of naming things, we've named it James. So in this letter, James writes this profound insight that is probably one of the most powerful tools that we can find for relationships and conflict in all the Bible. And James introduces a principle and a concept by asking a question. And he says, what causes quarrels and fights among you? I imagine we all have an answer to this extremely reasonable question. And when you hear this question, what causes quarrels and fights among you, we instantly get out our fingers and we start pointing at others and saying, it's them, and we're blaming others. But here's the truth about that. As long as you blame others for your unhappiness, you'll always be unhappy. So if I take my happiness and I hand it to the person I'm in conflict with, and I say, hey, I'm upset with you right now, and so I'm going to give you my potential for happiness. And you just go on and you just hold on to it, and then whenever you feel like it, why don't you just give it back to me? Because obviously I can't be happy unless you allow me to be happy. I mean, who would purposely do that? I can't think of anyone that would purposely say, just take my happiness and, when you feel like it, I'll take it back. However, every time I blame, I give away my happiness. Look, I don't want to give away any of my happiness. I want to be happy. You probably don't want to give away any of yours either because you want to be happy. However, part of refusing or learning how not to do that is what James is going to explain to us today. So I'm going to be reading from James 4. Maybe you want to read along in your Bible if you've got one of those with paper, or maybe one of those electric ones that glow in your face. Whatever you use. Maybe you'll want to read the word yourself and kind of let them jump off the pages at you. And as we read along, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to say some things, I'm going to read some things, and some of you might want to push back. You might want to resist it, and that's okay. Even if you think you want to argue with me, I'm going to tell you up front, I didn't come up with this stuff. I'm just not smart enough. I'm just not bold enough. And the only reason I would bring this here and want to teach it to you guys, and to myself, quite honestly, is because it's right there in our true source, the Bible. And I believe that if we can take the time to learn to do this hard work, it can radically change the relationships we have around us, and particularly in our family. So James 4, it starts out like this. He says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from the desires that battle within you? So James asks, and then he answers the questions for you. Your fights among you are because of the desires in you. And then you probably want to respond, no, they don't, James. My fights and quarrels, they come from the things outside of me because, he won't do this thing or she's always doing too much of that thing. And we get in this blame game. And James says to us, no, these quarrels and the fights, they don't come because of something outside of us. They come from inside of us, something that's going on in us. He says, so you have this desire in every conflict, specifically family. And there's a desire that you have that's spilling out into all the people around you. And so James writes, you desire, but you do not have. So you have this unmet desire, and every time there is a conflict, you're wanting something. Every conflict, you have your agenda, your ideas, what you want over and over with your family. And the result is something that you want and do not have. And then James, he throws this, I'm going to change his name to Joe. And then James throws this tagline out there and he says, you desire but you do not have, so you kill. And this is pretty heavy. And think about it, James is writing to the church. This isn't a letter to prisoners. This isn't a letter to convicts, to people on death row. He writes it to the church and he says, you're not getting what you want, so you kill. And he's using this extreme hyperbole, right? And it's so relevant when we think about what happens to us and families when we quarrel and fight, when we have unresolved conflict. Sometimes there's things that you and I want so badly that we're willing to run over and hurt the people that are closest to us, the people that mean the most to us, just so we can get what we want. And when we don't learn that we automatically have the potential, the propensity, the opportunity, and the motive to do this, and to take the time to learn from it, we're going to destroy our closest relationships. When you want something from mom, dad, sister, brother, or anyone, if you want it badly enough, that desire will cause you to lose perspective and to pursue it so much that you would destroy the relationship with that other person. And it's something that happens again and again in our relationships. And the entire time that you're arguing, you're fussing, nagging, belittling the other person, you're attempting to tell yourself that it's the other person's fault. And James says, no way, man, it's you. You want something and you're not getting it. So you'll use your words, you'll use your actions, and anything else you can think of to get what you want one way or another. Imagine, if you can, if you will, what it would look like in our homes if we learned to manage this one idea. James goes on and he says in the next, or finishes with that verse, and he says, you covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. So James asks, why don't we get along? And then he answers it. Because each of us wants something from the other, and we can't get it. Think about an argument or a conflict you were involved in last month, maybe the past week, maybe today, I don't know. And you're in the middle of that conflict, and perhaps you just stop and you look at the other person and you said, hey, you know what? I think part of the problem right now, I think it's me. Part of the problem is I'm just not getting what I want. How would that go over in that setting? How much would that impact your relationship and really change the game? And so if we practice that, we think about it, there's a situation where you're on the verge of losing control, and then all of a sudden this light bulb comes on and you go, oh, I remember this talk with Ryan one really cold January Sunday about James and this letter he wrote. And maybe instead of pointing fingers, you say, hey, maybe not all the problem, perhaps some of it, maybe just a little bit, maybe it's just me. Because I realize part of the conflict is I'm not getting what I want. And there's a really good chance that maybe someone here today or someone listening to this later online is saying, I wish my fill in the blank was here to hear this. I could really see them getting a lot if they heard this and grasped onto it. Oops, I did it again. I played with your heart. No. Oh man, I did it again. I made it all about them. It's their fault. So let's try this together. Part of the problem is I'm not getting what I want. What would happen in our families, in our homes, if this were to happen, this kind of idea? Now there's a good chance most of us won't do it, and why? Because if I own part of the problem in the midst of the conflict and the tension, it'll dissipate. The fire of my anger is going to start losing energy. You lose part of the argument, and more than that, you lose part of your leverage. And James is saying that if everyone in our family admits to their part, then everyone loses a little leverage. And then you won't fight and quarrel quite as much. Now, there's probably somebody that wants to stand up like a defendant representing themselves in court and yell, "Objection!" But he promised me, she promised me. And my ask isn't unusual, it's not out of the norm. And we made a commitment. And we said that if you do this, I do that, and we'd meet at this spot. And I did my part. And despite all their promises, they didn't follow through. And I understand that. I get that. And the hurt that we feel that comes from unmet expectations and unfulfilled desires. But what if it went like this? I want you to keep your promise, and I'm not getting what I want. I want you to know that what you did and what you said you would do, I'm not getting what I want. And perhaps as we're wrestling with all these conflicts, what if the image of the other person, the way we see them, starts to change, and we start to see ourselves in the mirror, and it changes things? The poet Michael Jackson wrote about that. I'm looking at the man in the mirror. See how many quotes I can throw in here tonight. But James, he doesn't stop there. He goes on and he writes, "You do not have because you do not ask God." James takes us deeper spiritually. He looks us straight in the eyes and he says, you don't have because you don't ask God. And James is causing us to reflect and to think. Has it occurred to you that before you go extracting something from someone, you go to try to take it from them for your benefit, before you go and get at them, has it ever occurred that perhaps you should just get on your knees and pour out your heart to God? God, there's something that I want from my kids. God, there's something that I want from my spouse. Whatever it is, God, I'm just not getting it. And now, perhaps, some of you here, maybe you do that. Before you confront, you pray. God, help me with this conversation. God, prepare me. God, prepare them for this. Because when we decide to bring these things to God, what happens? That little piece that's my fault causes me to realize that there's things in me that I need to focus on, so that I don't just focus on the other person. Now, when this happens, the conversation's going to get better. Because you know what part of the problem is? I'm just not getting what I want. And I realize that part of what I do want, you actually don't have to give. James brings this conclusion to his instruction. And this conclusion, it's a tough pill to swallow because it's the part we don't ever like to hear. And he says, when you ask, you do not receive because you ask with the wrong motives, that you can spend what you get on your own pleasures. I've prayed over conflicts and conversations, and it turned out God didn't do it the way I wanted him to do it. And it was really tough for me to deal with that. He just didn't do what I wanted. And I find out that God loves us so much that he doesn't want to mess us up by giving us what we want or what we ask for. Because really, we deceive ourselves most of the time. We probably lie to ourselves more than we do anyone else. James says, have you asked God about this? And when you say yes, and so then James asks, good, can you take no as an answer? And can you own your part of it? We have to realize that in the midst of this conflict and not getting what I'm wanting, it's really because I've made it all about me. And it's not honestly what's best for everyone involved. So as we close, I'm going to ask you this question. Who in your family is suffering because you're not getting your way? Who is feeling pressured because they just don't measure up to your expectation of what you think they should be? What would happen in your family if you were able to relieve them of some of that pressure of your expectation? It's likely that their feeling of inadequacy is actually your issue and not theirs. Who out there today is suffering because you refuse to admit that this conflict might have more to do with you than it does with them? What would happen if you took the bold move today to reach out through a letter, an email, a text, or a phone call and begin this journey of taking away the unnecessary and inappropriate pressure that you've placed on them and release it? Do you know who you quarrel and fight with in your family? Is it because you're not getting what you want? And then do you know why your family quarrels and fights back with you? Because they're not getting what they want. In the ideal world where men and women are really seeking to know God and to follow Jesus, we would have a pause before our storm. We would pause and reflect before starting these conversations. And there would be this moment where I would say, Jesus, before I start this conversation, or maybe before I confront this person, hey, God, there's this conversation that needs to happen. And so before I dive into that, I need to recognize that this is what I want. And what I want needs to be dealt with in me and in my heart first. And I want to deal with that right here, right now, God, before I take it over there. While we live in the real, I believe God is hoping that we will stretch ourselves and strive to experience more and more of His ideal. And so, God, please do that in me first. Would you guys pray with me? God, thank you for your word that gives us instruction in every aspect of our life of how to love our neighbor, how to love ourselves, and to love you, and to love our family better. And I pray that we all answer this question honestly with ourselves, and we take those simple, easy steps to reach out and to begin the reconciliation and to begin this healing process that even in conflict, when it needs to happen, that will take a pause and we'll come to you in prayer about it first. And will allow you to deal with our part of the conflict first. Take some of the steam out of our fire, out of our energy, so that we can love better and have better understandings in our family. And that we'll even go through conflict in our lives more productively. We love you and we look forward to being back together next week to celebrate you in this place. In Jesus' name.